So in topic 3, we will first look at terrestrial ecosystems, their components and interactions. This third topic is based on the second chapter in the prescribed text, Plant Science, edited by Margaret McMahon, and this module covers terrestrial ecosystems and their relationship to cultivating plants. So before we get into the individual disciplines of horticulture, it's necessary to study a few aspects about those things that influence those crop disciplines. So these next 3 modules or topics, topic 3, terrestrial ecosystems, topic 4, growing plants for human use, and topic 5, climatic effects on horticultural plants, will provide some background. In this module, we will learn to understand natural ecosystems that a crop system replaces, so that we can determine how to overcome limitations to have the desired productivity while reducing inputs for sustainable horticulture. This module will help to develop your understanding of ecosystems. So the learning objectives for topic 3 are to allow students to be able to describe the components of ecosystems and their relationship to each other, define biome, and be able to describe the factors that create biomes. Learn the major biomes of the world and Australia, and describe the potential of each one to support sustainable horticultural ecosystems. Describe how succession relates to the development of ecosystems and how succession is a consideration in crop ecosystems. And finally, to describe the concept of human footprint and how cultivating plants has impacted natural ecosystems. So terrestrial ecosystems, such as this Australian one depicted, are a collection of organisms, plants, animals, and microorganisms such as fungi and bacteria, in an area that, over time, have developed intricate relationships that involve the sharing of energy and resources such as water and nutrients. The populations of the various organisms remain stable, and the ecosystem itself is self-sustaining because of these relationships. To maintain sustainable relationships, all ecosystems require a source of energy. So just a bit of revision from earlier plant science subjects. Plants provide that energy through photosynthesis, in which solar energy is converted to chemical energy. This biochemical energy is stored in plant structures in complex carbon-based molecules. When other organisms consume the plant or its parts, the energy in the plant is transferred to that organism. In turn, when those organisms are consumed, the energy is passed on. Photosynthetic productivity is the measure of the amount of carbon molecules created, and the higher the photosynthetic productivity, the more the energy that is available to support the system. A crop ecosystem is, however, usually very different from the natural one it replaced. Most often, it is not there long enough for stable organismal relationships to develop. In many cases, the crop may not be best suited biologically for that area, especially if it evolved in a different type of biome. Generally, the more a crop ecosystem differs from the ecosystem that would occur naturally in an area, the lower its photosynthetic productivity, sustainability, and potential yield of the crop. Because of this, the crop ecosystem requires more inputs to get the desired productivity and sustainability. If we better understand the natural ecosystem that a crop system is replacing, we can understand the ecological relationships and ecosystem processes that would naturally occur and attempt to mimic those as much as possible to achieve the desired productivity while reducing inputs. In other words, more sustainable horticultural production. An ecosystem consists of a community of organisms in a physical environment that share the resources in that environment. That physical environment consists of soil and atmosphere in the case of a terrestrial ecosystem. The community consists of populations of individual species, different kinds of plants, of animals, of microorganisms such as fungi, bacteria, and so on. Now, a population can be defined as all of the individuals of the species that inhabit a particular environment. The way that we define the environment determines the boundaries of the population. Often we think of a limited area in which the individuals share the available resources. So these can be small or they can be large. So for example, in an isolated area of woodland, such as this Australian woodland illustrated, or in a field, or in a greenhouse, the plants will be competing for light, water, and nutrients available in that specific area. On the other hand, ecological relationships may extend over large areas, particularly for animals that can roam from one place to another. Even for plants, pollination may occur between individuals in physically separate environments many miles apart. Almost all terrestrial ecosystems depend on the ability of plants to capture energy from the sun through photosynthesis and to store it in complex carbon-based organic molecules, which we call carbon fixation or carbon sequestering. These molecules constitute most of the plant's biomass. How much biomass is produced is called photosynthetic productivity. The more biomass, the more energy to support the ecosystem. Other organisms feed on the plants and utilize the energy stored in the plant, enabling them to live. An ecosystem is formed and then becomes stable when the relationship between the organisms does not change much over time. The greater the photosynthetic productivity, the more energy is available to support and maintain that ecosystem. The energy in the plant is utilized by other ecosystem organisms, and the carbon and other plant components, such as nutritional components, for example, nitrogen and phosphorus, are recycled back into the system. The amount of carbon fixed is called photosynthetic productivity. In all other organisms, the ecosystem depends on the plant productivity in one way or another to survive. A cultivated ecosystem, such as this Western Australian garlic field, may look too simple to qualify as an ecosystem, but a whole community of organisms interacts with the single species of plant, both above and below the ground. Many of the functions and ecological interactions that sustain the ecosystems are carried out by small invertebrate animals, fungi, and bacteria, or microflora and microfauna, and many of these organisms are in the soil. The microflora and fauna are, relatively speaking, even more important in crop ecosystems, where we deliberately try to exclude macrofauna, such as birds and mammals, and non-crop macroflora, in other words, weeds. What distinguishes these cultivated ecosystems is that some of the organisms, processes, and interactions that would sustain a natural ecosystem are either absent or heavily modified by human intervention. For example, inputs of nutrients are necessary to promote plant growth, or chemicals are needed to suppress disease, insects, and weeds. We tend to describe crop production in terms of these inputs only and ignore the ecological processes and interactions. However, the goal of sustainable horticultural production requires that we minimize the inputs and that we maximize the contribution of natural ecosystem processes. So, by observing the full range of interactions and processes in natural ecosystems, we can learn how to manage crop ecosystems to help achieve the goal of sustainable and profitable horticultural production. Competition occurs when one or more organism draws on a resource that is in short supply. The limited resources might be required for growth or the reproduction of an organism. So, in a competing system, one or more of these organisms needing the common resource usually does not get enough, or its numbers are reduced, or it disappears altogether. In ecosystems with a complete cover of vegetation, for example, the most intense competition among plants is for light. A plant with greater leaf area is likely to capture more light, particularly if the leaves are positioned above those of another plant. So therefore, trees can capture most of the light and are the dominant vegetation in many parts of the world. However, they have to invest considerable resources in the trunk and branches that support those leaves. Vines, for example, can compete for light with less structural investment than trees by using the support provided by the trees to grow tall enough to reach the sunlight. Shade plants adapted to the lower tiers of the forest can occupy those lower niches. So a niche describes the place an organism has in the ecosystem. A species is less likely to outcompete another if it occupies a different niche. So, for species to coexist in an ecosystem, they must occupy different niches. For example, trees in the upper canopy, vines growing on trees, and ferns in lower light lower down in the canopy. In healthy natural ecosystems, all available niches are occupied, and it is difficult for a new species to colonize, and this is what we call exclusion. In this diagram, species 1 is able to occupy a niche because species 2 does not use all of the resources. However, species 3 is subject to exclusion because it also needs those resources, but none remain. Crop ecosystems have one or few species that do not exploit all of the resources of the environment. Thus, niches tend to be available for other plants to colonize, such as weeds, and their presence is a problem to the extent that their resource requirements overlap with those of the crop species. And so, one of the strategies in weed control is to plant additional non-competitive crops or non-crop plants within the main crop to occupy niches that would otherwise be occupied by weeds, such as planting cover crops in young orchards. So resources captured by plants may be transferred through consumption to other organisms by predators or parasites. Predation occurs when plants are consumed by a wide range of animals which we call herbivores. Predators are also animals that consume other animals. Herbivores include mollusks, which are slugs and snails, arthropods, such as insects and mites, mammals, and birds. The diversity and large numbers of herbivores emphasize the importance of plants as a food source in terrestrial ecosystems. It's widely known that herbivores do not compete with each other or come close to consuming all of the plant food resources of natural ecosystems, because their numbers are kept in check by their own predators. There's a wide range of small predators among the arthropods, and there are many insect-eating birds and mammals. Large predators that feed on birds and mammals are less common because ecosystems cannot support many of them. As the number of herbivores increases, they become easy prey for predators. Crop ecosystems are usually more vulnerable to herbivory because the number of predators is low or non-existent. Thus, it may be necessary to introduce control measures such as chemicals, introduced predators and parasites, which are biocontrols, or other means to control slugs, insects, rodents, birds, or other herbivores. So, now just a few comments about the various other components of natural and crop ecosystems other than the plants themselves. It's important to know these components and how they affect natural and crop ecosystems so that we understand how to encourage them or whether to intervene. So one component is parasites. So these are organisms that derive their nutrition by living in or on the tissues of another organism, often producing symptoms of disease such as swellings or discolored tissue. Plant parasites include many kinds of viruses, bacteria, and fungi. For example, onion smut, which is illustrated here. Those parasites which can grow only in the host are called obligate parasites. Parasites which can grow outside the plant are called facultative parasites. All viruses are obligate parasites, whereas fungi and bacteria may be obligate parasites or facultative parasites, as many can commonly exist outside the plant, usually in the soil. There are a few parasitic plants which can infect plants in natural and crop ecosystems, but these are less common than the usual fungal, bacterial, and viral parasites. Other classes of plant parasites include nematodes and some insects and mites, particularly those that form galls on leaves and stems. Now, parasites differ from herbivores because they cause disease rather than simply eating their way through the tissue. In a disease, the physiology and often the morphology of the host is altered, as its resources are redirected towards the pathogen or disease-causing organism. The host is weakened by parasites, making it vulnerable to attacks by other secondary organisms, or it may even kill the organism. Another component of ecosystems is parasitoids. Now, parasitoids are animals, mostly insects, which spend the juvenile phase of their life cycle in the tissues of another insect. When they emerge as adults, the host is killed. Now, parasitoids can be helpful in crop ecosystems when they infect herbivorous insects, such as caterpillars. Some biological pest controls, such as parasitic wasps, that are used commercially to control plant pests are parasitoids, such as this parasitic wasp laying an egg in an aphid. When the egg hatches, the wasp larva will feed on the internal organs of the aphid, and the aphid dies. Now, the female wasp will lay eggs in numerous aphid hosts, thereby depleting the aphid population and its detrimental effects on the host plant. Another positive component of ecosystems is that of symbiotic relationships between organisms. This relationship is a permanent and close association between two organisms that are known as symbionts. In natural ecosystems, the roots of most plants are colonized by fungi that draw nutrients from the soil and pass some of them onto the plant. In return, the plant passes sugar and other organic molecules to the fungus. These fungi are known as mycorrhizae, and they can either live on the surface of the root, in which case they're called ectomycorrhizae, or they can invade the root tissue, in which case they are called endomycorrhizae. Now, mycorrhizae are less common in crop ecosystems than in the wild, and one reason is that they are slow to establish and to have the desired effect. And usually the nutritional requirements of crops are supplied by fertilizers, and fungi are not needed to scavenge for them. However, mycorrhizae are now being supplied to several crops to reduce the need for chemical fertilizers. Now, another example of symbiosis is lichens, which are found on tree trunks, on rocks, and sometimes on the soil surface. And they are formed by the symbiosis of a fungus with an algae species. And they occur in natural ecosystems. Another kind of plant symbiosis involves a bacterial symbiont, rhizobium, that forms nitrogen-fixing nodules illustrated in the slide, usually on the roots of many species of the legume family, scientifically known as the Fabaceae. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria take nitrogen from the air, convert it to a form that the plants can use. In turn, the rhizobium bacteria gain sugar and other components from the host legume. They are very important for maintaining the nitrogen supply in natural ecosystems and are useful in growing of legume crops, which include many important crops such as beans, peas, and lucerne. Rotating a nitrogen-fixing legume crop such as soybean or lucerne with a non-legume on a regular basis is a common farming practice to keep nitrogen levels up in a paddock or a field. In more general term, for a mutually beneficial association between organisms is commensalism. And in addition to the fungal and bacterial symbiosis that already mentioned, commensalism also includes less permanent associations, such as that between a plant and its pollinating insect. Although parasitic organisms may be the most conspicuous fungi and bacteria in crop ecosystems, most microorganisms are saprophytes that digest dead plant and animal material at or below the surface, as illustrated. Saprophytes are essential to the survival of the ecosystem because they recycle nutrients that would otherwise be tied up in dead organisms. In natural ecosystems, a few plant species are saprophytic. Saprophytes are aided in their activity by detritivores that break up large pieces of organic matter as they consume it. Earthworms are an important part of this group, which also includes other kinds of worms, some insects, and small mammals. Now, detritivores and saprophytes may be less important in crop ecosystems than in nature because crops and crop residues are removed and the nutrients are replaced by synthetic fertilizers. However, they become more important as we try to recycle crop waste and minimize fertilizer inputs to develop more sustainable horticultural production systems. Primary producers, mainly plants, herbivores, parasites, commensals, detritivores, and saprophytes exist in all terrestrial ecosystems. In a natural ecosystem, each of these roles is filled by many species of organisms that exist in a complex web of relationships, as illustrated. Nutrients are passed continuously from one organism to another, along with energy and carbon compounds that sustain the whole ecosystem, and that originally came from the primary producers, which are the plants. The system tends to be highly conserved. Many organisms compete for the resources available at any level in this food web. If there is any gap in the utilization of resources, species are recruited to fill it. On the other hand, crop ecosystems are based on one or a few plant species, which are usually intended to be harvested rather than allowing the resources to be consumed by other species. While the crop is growing, however, surplus resources exist that could be exploited by competitors, herbivores, and parasites. In the past, we have attempted to manage these problems by mechanical and chemical means. By eliminating a species, we attempt to simplify the ecosystem and minimize ecological interactions. More recently, however, we have begun to introduce species that help control some of the problems. For example, cover crops, predators, parasitoids, and so on, moving towards more sustainable horticultural production systems. So in summary, we've looked at terrestrial ecosystems, both natural and crop, and we have looked at the various components of these ecosystems and how they interact. In the next part of this module, we will look at biomes. Now, a biome is a collection of ecosystems with similar climate, soil, and plant composition. Identifying biomes is important to determine strategies for growing plants sustainably.